And now Nuala O'Fwellin's My Dream of You. She is a remarkable woman, Nuala O'Fwellin. She is an Irish woman, 62 years old, and on a recent interview on one of the New York City talk shows, the first question she had from the interviewer was, Ms. O'Fwellin, you have slept with dozens and dozens and dozens of men. And Nuala O'Fwellin said, yes, yes. And I have to talk about that a little bit of biography of Nuala O'Fwellin. She was born 62 years ago, just outside Dublin. She is the second of 9 children. Her father was a newspaper gossip columnist who was rarely at home. He was the classic absentee father. And her mother was a cold, unfeeling alcoholic. Nuala O'Fwellin had a remarkable education. She studied on scholarship at the University of Dublin and then at the universities of Hull and Oxford in England. She has degrees in medieval literature, 19th century literature, and in French. For most of her adult life, she has made a living from the media. She was a book reviewer for the London Times, a television producer for BBC Television and for Irish TV, and she lectured in media studies at the university in Dublin. For very many years, she had a daily opinion column, very widely read in the Irish Times. And in 1996, an Irish publisher approached her and said, we'd like to put out a collection of your best newspaper columns. Nuala O'Fwellin decided to preface the collection of columns with a slice of autobiography. And the autobiographical introduction to her memoir, which is called The Accidental Memoir of a Dublin Woman, was so well received in Ireland that when the book was taken up by British and American publishers, they left out the opinion columns and asked her to enlarge the autobiography. And it was published as The Accidental Memoir of a Dublin Woman, Are You Somebody? Nuala O'Fwellin, with her autobiography, joined the likes of James Joyce, Brendan Behan, and Frank McCourt as a chronicler of Irish pain. As she says in her autobiography, speaking of her 8 siblings, one of whom drank himself to death, I quote from the autobiography, "My brother and I are carrying the Irish sickness. Drink for men, anger for women." And there has indeed been pain, drink, and anger in Nuala O'Fwellin's life. In her autobiography, she says she has no happy memory of childhood. Never once, not once, did her family ever go on an outing. She says in her autobiography that she has never been able to exorcise the ghost of her mother. Quote, "The primitive hostility my mother expressed in her drinking." In 1997, after her autobiography was published in the United States, she came from Ireland to New York City to be part of a promotional tour, and she fell in love with New York City. As she says in her second memoir, she published the autobiography, then the novel, My Dream of You, and then a second volume of autobiography, Almost There. And she says in that second volume, quote, "I love New York. I find it completely liberating. A great big immigrant place. Everyone is on their way somewhere else. I think it's wonderful, the history of immigration, of self-belief. New York is a great credit to the human race." She spent a straight 18 months in New York City, and it was there that she began to write tonight's novel, My Dream of You. And now she divides her time 6 months a year in Ireland, in her cottage in County Clare, and 6 months a year in New York City. According to her 2 volumes of autobiography, in which she speaks very frankly about her life, she has been promiscuous since her adolescence. She has indeed slept with dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of men. She has slept, this 62-year-old woman, she has slept with anybody who asked her. She also had a 15-year relationship, a live-in relationship with another woman. But that didn't diminish her heterosexual activity, and the 15-year-old affair ended badly. In recent years, in 50 months of the last 6 years, she also had an affair with a much older man, a married man, an Irish truck driver. She picked him up in a bar, and whenever he was driving, whenever he phoned her, an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours away, she would drive all that time to have sex with him in a backstreet hotel. They rarely spoke. All Nuala O'Fwellin's Irish lover had to say to her was, quote, on the phone, "Is that my little girl?" And she melted, and she drove, and they had sex. There has been, in the life of this 60-year-old woman, one major recent development. But I will leave that for the end of my talk. By her own admission, Nuala O'Fwellin has never married, has never had a child. She is a well-traveled, well-educated, hard-drinking, promiscuous feminist who has never found the love that she was denied in childhood by her mother and father. And in spite of her professional success as a writer, Nuala O'Fwellin has a deep fear of an approaching old age in which she will be childless and alone. And if any of you see a connection between the writer, Nuala O'Fwellin, and the protagonist in tonight's novel, my dream of you, so be it. I am not a believer that all writing is autobiography. I do not believe that Shakespeare is Macbeth or King Lear. I don't believe that Christopher Marlowe is Tamburlaine. But it is obviously true that all writers cull some of their material from their own life experiences. It is equally true that a first novel, and My Dream of You is a first novel, though not a first book, that a first novel will tend to have autobiographical overtones. Nuala O'Fwellin makes no secret of this when she talked about the novel in her second volume of autobiography. Her creation, Kathleen de Burgh, is turning 50. When Nuala O'Fwellin wrote the novel, she was turning 60, and a decade makes a difference, but there are far more similarities than differences between the author and her protagonist. Both the novelist and her character are women who do not love themselves. And they are both the daughters of women who did not love themselves. The change that takes place in the novel, in Kathleen de Burgh, are the same changes that were taking place in the author, Nuala O'Fwellin, as she wrote the novel. As she says in the second volume of memoir written after the novel, quote, what happened to Kathleen wasn't just a byproduct of the making of a fiction. I was changing myself in symbiosis with my heroine. But within the novel, Kathleen de Burgh is not just a fictionalized portrait of Nuala O'Fwellin. She is a fully realized person in her own right. And at the end of the novel, the character, Kathleen de Burgh, will make a decision about life that was not the decision that the author intended that she make when she began writing the novel. And it is now time that we meet Kathleen de Burgh. On her birth certificate in Ireland, our protagonist is Cochleen de Burgo, the Gaelic pronunciation of her name. The family name, in fact, had always been Burke, but the father had changed it to de Burgh or de Burgo in a fit of Irish patriotism. In the novel, Kathleen de Burgh was born about 1950 in a small town, Kilcrennan, in the Republic of Ireland. Her father was a minor civil servant and inspector of weights and measures who loved his title, Inspector de Burgh, a man full of his own importance. And when we meet Kathleen de Burgh on the first pages of the novel, she is 49 years old, just about to turn 50. And we learn of her childhood through the memories she has of her childhood. And memory will play a large part in the novel. We live much of the novel in the mind of Kathleen de Burgh. And one of the many virtues of the novel is that the narrative follows the processes of the human mind. We, human beings, we do not think in linear progression from A to B to C to D. Rather, the human mind is a maelstrom, a confusion of past and present. We perform an act, it arouses a memory, which takes us to another memory, which takes us to an image of the present or the past, which brings us back to the present. And it is one of Nuala O'Fwearin's great achievements that because of her exquisitely clean prose, it is never difficult, I think, in the novel, for us to follow Kathleen de Burgh's progress as she thinks and acts and remembers and hopes. She remembers, 49-year-old Kathleen de Burgh, that, quote, "My father was angry nearly all the time, and my mother just went around in a silent bubble. I don't know why they bothered to have children. But they did have children, Mr. and Mrs. de Burgh. This was Catholic Ireland in the 1950s and 60s. The teachings of the Roman Catholic Church were written into the Constitution of the Republic of Ireland, which gained its independence from England in 1922. The teachings of the church were written into the Constitution. According to the Constitution of Ireland, there could be no divorce, no abortion, no teaching of family planning, no contraception. And this is key, if a pregnant mother's life were in danger, they saved the child and not the mother. Most of Kathleen de Burgh's mother's children did not survive childbirth. Living, there were only the older sister Nora, Kathleen herself, her younger brother Danny, and another younger brother Sean, who died when he was 6. Half a century later, Kathleen de Burgh tries to consider her family objectively. From page 21, "My family has been the same size and shape in my head since I ran out of Ireland. Mother, victim. Nora and me and Danny and poor little Sean, neglected victims of her victimhood. Villain, father. Old style, Irish Catholic patriarch. Unkind to wife, unloving to children, harsh to young Kathleen when she tried to talk to him. She had 1 or 2 happy memories of her childhood. When she won at the age of 10 or 11, £10 in an essay writing contest by a newspaper. And when she went with her mother to spend the money, to buy her mother a new dress, she sees on her mother's arms the livid bruises. The happy memories were few and far between, and they were always modified. Her older sister, Nora, fled from the family to America, to New York. And that's like an echo of what happened in the previous century, in the 1840s, when so many Irish fled from starving Ireland to the New World. Kathleen's own crisis comes after she has spent 2 years at Trinity College in Dublin. Her mother, as she remembers her youth when she was 20, her mother is pregnant again in hospital in Dublin with cancer of the womb. The hospital is Catholic, so terminating the pregnancy, removing the womb, out of the question. So is radiation therapy. Even the administration of morphine to relieve the agony of cancer, because nothing in Catholic Ireland must be done to endanger the birth of the child. And Kathleen is certainly not comforted when her landlady, Mrs. O'Connor, says, maybe it's part of God's plan. She begs her father, Kathleen, 20-year-old Kathleen, to move her mother out of a Catholic hospital to one of the few non-Catholic hospitals where she might be saved, or at least the agony relieved. And I found the father's refusal brilliantly dramatic and revealing of who he was. From page 495, the father speaking. I'll say it just once. That's my child, the same as you are. The child has as many rights as you have. Your mother is my wife. Your mother and I were married in the Catholic Church, and God willing, we will be buried in a Catholic cemetery. I'll take you to court, I said. Do, he said, and give us all a laugh. Then he nodded to the security guard. They put outside the door of Mammy's room. That's her, he said, pointing to me. She's not to be let in at any time. The young Kathleen, 20 years old, plans to kidnap her mother and take her to safety. She sends her mother a note to prepare for the evacuation, but the mother is moved to isolation, and she never gets the note. And Kathleen later remembers, page 500, it was the worst pain I have ever known. To think that since she did not get my note, she may have believed in the 3 weeks of agony that remained to her that I had abandoned her. And it is then that Kathleen makes her decision as she punches and spits at her father in the car park outside the hospital. Quote, if murdering poor sick women like Mammy was how church and state acted 2,000 years after Christ, I didn't want to know. And the last line of that episode is given to Kathleen's landlady in Dublin, the indomitable Mrs. O'Connor. Kathleen says to her, quote, I don't want to live in Ireland. I don't ever want to set foot on Irish soil again. And Mrs. O'Connor, who has learned, like all good Catholic Irish women of that period, to bow before God's cosmic plan, says a line that I find funny and Pearl, my wife, finds heartbreaking. For God's sake, if the rest of us can put up with it, why can't you? By the way, Kathleen's venom against her father is not nearly as extreme as her sister Nora, who fled to America. Kathleen phones her sister to say that Mammy is dying. She should come. And Nora says, I quote, page 489, she's still no good to me. That woman never did or said anything in her life that was of any use to me. And she put up with that old pig. I'd have to see him too if I came over. Why should I spend $1,000 to go all the way to Ireland to puke my guts up at the sight of him? And so comes to an end Kathleen's youth. She goes to England and a new stage in her life. But that new stage in her life, like the rest of her life, will be marked by the scars of her childhood. And all these early memories are revealed to us at the very end of the novel. Just as Kathleen learns very late in the novel that her father, after the death of his wife, her mother, made a second marriage. And she learns that his second wife made him very miserable. And I think that there is just enough Catholicism left in Nuala of Llywelyn, the author, to inject that lovely little touch of divine retribution into the text. I know that the news that Inspector de Burca was miserable in his later life pleased at least one reader of the novel. As I've said before, as I've said to you before, my mother told me, Rob, you are a good hater. After Catholic Ireland condemns her mother to an agonizing death from cancer, Kathleen goes to London. One might wonder why she doesn't go to New York to join her sister Nora. And the answer is that Kathleen, as a result of her childhood, is soured on human relationships. She doesn't want to be close to her now American sister. I quote Kathleen, page 213, I didn't really know how to touch people except as part of sex. Now, Kathleen goes to London, but she is not naive about London, about England. She has worked there during vacations as a student. She has seen the same notices that her father once saw when he worked briefly in England. I saw them when I came to London, 1954, when I left my native South Wales. Notices in the Irish areas like Hammersmith, Willesden, Acton. Notices outside boarding houses, no blacks, no Irish. All through the novel, Kathleen de Burca, living in London, based in London, will have a love-hate relationship with England. She admires the bravery of the English that she read about during the Second World War, when we stood alone from 1939 till 1941. Later in the novel, when as a writer she visits Dachau and Auschwitz and Buchenwald, she even phones the Irish nuns who taught her and says, why did we remain neutral in the war when the English were so brave? But she also knows, Kathleen de Burca, that to be Irish in England, even now, is to be despised, to be laughed at. Whatever Kathleen feels about the Catholic Ireland she has rejected, she knows she will be made to feel her Irishness in every waking moment that she spends in England. But when she is 20 and she must leave Ireland, England, London have one great virtue. Her father doesn't live there, and it is nearby. And London is a big city. And so she goes. And in London, she takes night courses in journalism. During the day, she supports herself by cleaning private houses and pubs. She meets a law student, Hugo, whose family are going on holiday to Greece, and they arrange to meet in Greece. And in Greece, when they meet, Kathleen is admitted into paradise. On page 244, I had lost my virginity soon after I went to Dublin, and after that, although I knew lots of boys, I never had sex with them. But now, in Greece, the whole of me lifted toward Hugo. Our eyes closed at the end, as each of us turned in towards ourselves. My being was caught up in a river of sensation that ran faster and faster toward a silken weir. I was held on the edge for a moment, and then I was carried over. I overflowed and slid over and was carried down into the thunder of a waterfall. The explosion went everywhere. Spray after diamond spray of it. I wept with happiness and relief. and he held me passionately close, and I whispered to him, "Thank you, thank you." And when they come back to London, Kathleen and Hugo set up home together in South London by Clapham Common in the early 1970s. And near Clapham Common, they create the Garden of Eden. They create the microcosm of lovers that John Donne spoke about in his poetry. From the first page of the novel, he was doing law in the daytime, and I the journalism diploma at night, but on the weekends we played. We lived on the mattress as on a raft. We gathered everything we needed or wanted around us on the floorboards, reaching out for things from under the quilt when it was cold, and in summer, sprawling across the sunlit sheets. But the serpent was in the Garden of Eden. And the serpent, the canker, was the vision that Kathleen had learned from her parents as a child, that woman is no more than a receptacle. Much later, Kathleen will reflect on that canker within her. I quote page 255, "It was Daddy's fault for not loving me, or Mammy's fault for having sex with Daddy when they never even talked to each other. It was Catholic Ireland's fault for sending me out into the world without a shred of inner moral sense. And it was England's fault for making me feel inferior and unwelcome, except when someone wanted to fuck me." She has a little Eden, Donne's microcosm, the perfect union of two lovers. But when Sasha, whom we know only as, quote, the French guy from upstairs, comes into her bathroom as she steps out of the shower, she offers no resistance. As she says, page 248, "My mind was completely empty. He just came into me with ease. I was full of him. When the movement stopped because he was all the way in, that was what I was. I was a receptacle that was completely and deeply full." She starts to sleep with Sasha whenever he waits for her when she comes home from work. And at work, she starts to pleasure the janitor in his little room under the stairs. And for a few months, she was happy. I quote her, "She was full of confidence and energy. She was giving sexual satisfaction to 3 men at the same time. According to the image of woman she had received in childhood, that they are no more than receptacles for men, she is doing 3 times as well as her mother." And then, of course, Hugo discovers her infidelity. He throws her out. And she thinks later that perhaps she meant him to, that she had arranged her own expulsion from Eden. She had caused herself to be found out. And who knows why she shied away from happiness, why she shied away from paradise. Was it merely her low self-image, the image of woman derived from the Catholic theocracy of Ireland? Or was there some element of self-punishment for failing to rescue her mother? We will never know, because who can know the human mind? After she is thrown out by Hugo, she is taken in by a friend, Carolyn. But that relationship with Carolyn ends until Carolyn later forgives her, when she permits Carolyn's boyfriend to grope her. And she permits Carolyn's father to molest her. And at 25, Kathleen de Burgh accepts what she thinks she is. For the next 25 years of her life, until she is 49, 50, quote, "For as long as I was asked, and no matter how often I was humiliated, I always said yes. But it was such an empty yes. Passion was something she could only dream of. Love was something outside her ken. She will make her living working as a travel writer. She works for Travel Right, capital letters, the travel section of a news distribution agency, for whom, for nearly 25 years, she will crisscross the world from one exotic location to another, churning out elegant, empty travel copy. At home in London, where she is based, she will bury herself alone in a basement just off a dingy area just near the Euston Road. And whether in London or abroad, she will continue to be an easy pickup. But as she puts it, quote, page 8, sex was a hotel thing. I don't think I'd have liked to disturb the perfect nothingness of where I lived. At work, she has two friends. Her avuncular boss, Alex, apparently asexual, who has the good breeding to apologize for his occasional anti-Irish outburst, and a gay colleague, Jimmy. They can be friends, even confidants, because they are no sexual threat to each other. Jimmy lives fewer than 20 minutes away in Soho, and in the nearly 25 years they work together, they are never once in each other's homes. Travel writing suits Kathleen de Burke perfectly, because as she says, I quote, "It was the only kind of journalism I could think of that didn't involve believing in anything at all. When she writes on travel, there is no hierarchy, no system of value, no hierarchy of meaning. One phenomenon, one sensation has no more importance than any other." This came home to me most dramatically in a conversation she has with Jimmy. They are thousands of miles apart. She's on a plane, on the phone. And she says to him, quote, "The plane was diverted. I forgot to pack my sunglasses. Did you have the duck with red currants? The maize crop has failed. They're trying to get a World Bank loan. I have a toothache." Nothing is more important than anything else. She is looking at the world and observing it, and there is no element of judgment, no element of hierarchy. And all the time there is this terrible casual sex. And sometimes during those moments of casual sex, Kathleen is struck by the thought, page 372, quote, "But this is ridiculous," when the man is on top of her. "But this is ridiculous. You do this to have babies." And as she considers the softness of her stomach, she imagines that, quote, "somewhere buried deep behind that flesh, there is a shriveled organ, tear-shaped. Wombs are tear-shaped because her images of herself, of childbearing, of woman, all derive from her mother and the horror of her childhood. I was struck as I read of her quarter of a century in the Euston Road basement, how Kathleen, traveling extensively for so much of a time and submitting for so often to the advances of strangers, was very much in the world, but not of the world. And then I thought about my own thought, how odd. In the world, but not of the world, is how traditionally we speak of nuns. And I thought that ironic. And then, just as she is about to turn 50, Kathleen de Burke lives through 3 experiences that will begin the process of her return to life. The first experience takes place in Harare, at the airport, the capital of Zimbabwe. There's a businessman. They speak on the plane, they go to bed after they land. This is hardly an epiphany. There have been so many businessmen and so many airports. But only 1 hour after their encounter, the businessman phones her room to say that he has to leave. Page 11. 1 hour after I'd been with him, he hadn't even waited until the next day. And that's what I learned from him, that my heart was still ridiculously alive. That's the first experience. The second, a few days later, Kathleen arrives on assignment in the Philippines. She goes to Manila. And just outside her hotel, she is crossing the highway. And there's a hedge dividing the highway. And she sees under the dusty hedge in the middle of the road something that stops her short. From page 11. 2 dirty-faced girls of 7 or 8 had a box under the hedge with an infant sleeping in it. And the 7-year-old says, "Dollar," and lifts up her skirt. I didn't know what she meant, and maybe she didn't either. What money I had in my pockets, I gave her. And then instead of checking into the hotel, I got a taxi to the airport, looking neither to the right nor the left. And much, much later in the novel, page 499, quote, she realizes that the 2 kids and the baby under the dusty hedge in the middle of the highway reminded me at some deep level of myself and my 2 brothers. For 25 years, Kathleen de Burqa has been observing humanity, but has kept it at arm's length. But at that moment in Manila, she begins to reconnect with the human condition. The process will take time, but it has begun. And then the third experience. She comes home from Manila to London to find that her friend, her confidant, Jimmy, has died of a heart attack. Her first reaction is to withdraw into the womb, her little basement flat off the Euston Road. And in that flat, to pass the time, to fill the hours until his funeral, she begins to read everything on her shelves. And one of the things she reads is something that her Hugo, her lover, had given her 25 years earlier. He thought it might interest her. It was an old divorce case, the Talbot case, a judgment of the House of Lords in 1856. At that time, the House of Lords was the only British institution that could grant a divorce. She's had it on her bookshelves for more than 25 years. It is, by the way, a true case. I know that the Talbot case, House of Lords proceedings, are in the Famine Library in County Roscommon in Ireland. Catherine de Burqa is drawn to the case as she works her way through her bookcase. She is drawn to the case because it took place during a terrible but fascinating period of Irish history in the 1840s. It refers to the 1840s. But more because the wife in the divorce case, Marion Talbot, seemed on the face of it to have conceived a passion for her servant, which led to love, which in turn led to a willingness to sacrifice everything. This is what she has been living for 25 years. Sex, which might lead to love, which might lead to total love, which is a willingness to sacrifice. She wants to know more about the case than the bare bones. She decides to quit her job and go to Ireland and research the Talbot case. She is going to take up the story of Marion Talbot's adultery and write it up, perhaps. She wants to understand how sex and then love could reach across such a chasm. The chasm between Marion Talbot and her Irish Catholic servant, William Mullen, was much greater than anything most of us can imagine. It is much greater than the chasm that existed, for example, between Lady Chatterley and her gamekeeper. The relationship that took place at the end of the 1840s, reported in the 1856 House of Lords decision. The relationship between the Protestant English Marion Talbot and the Gaelic-speaking Irish Catholic servant William Mullen was like a union between two species. As the novel says, page 66, each of them came from a powerful culture which had at its very core the defining of the other culture as alien. To understand how far apart were these two solitudes from which Marion Talbot and William Mullen came, we have to pause for a moment to consider very briefly Irish history. As you know, England conquered Ireland in the year 1171. And for nearly 800 years, the Irish hated their English conqueror, their English oppressor. That hatred was exacerbated when England went through a reformation under Henry VIII. England became Protestant, but Ireland remained staunchly loyal to Rome, to Catholicism. And that hatred was exacerbated even more when successive English rulers, notably Oliver Cromwell between 1649 and 1658, gave large land grants in Ireland, particularly in the north, to Scottish and English Protestants, hoping to dilute Catholicism in Ireland. The only result, of course, was to create two communities, English-speaking Protestant and Gaelic-speaking Catholic in Ireland, who hated each other. On one side, you have the Protestant landowners who, more often than not, had their real homes back in England. They had their own Anglican church. They called it, quote, the Church of Ireland. And of course, they spoke English. On the other hand, the great majority were the Irish peasantry, Roman Catholic, Gaelic speaking, often with only just enough English to accept the instructions of their employers. And that was the situation that obtained in Ireland in the 19th century. That was the situation that obtained in Ireland in the summer of 1846, when the first Irish labourer went into the cellar of his peat moss house and found that the potatoes had turned black. The potatoes he had stored for the winter, and there was no food. The potato blight had struck. And in 1846 began the 3 years of incredible famine. The potato was the only staple food in Ireland. And the suffering became beyond belief. The peak of the famine was the second year, 1847. The year the Irish call, and most history books call, the year of the Great Hunger. All this was known to 49-year-old Kathleen de Burgh. She remembers at 16 back in Ireland. She remembers being in a pageant organized by the nuns. I quote, page 49, I was one of the barefoot starving girls in shawls on the back of Murphy's coal lorry that had been lined with crepe paper. It had a big sign on it, 1847, the year of the Great Hunger. But the history is far from her, and she has no sense of sharing the humanity of those who suffered. She cannot see yet in her mind's eye the faces of the dying. So she researches the libraries in London. There is nothing in the London libraries on the Talbot case, other than the House of Lords report of 1856, of which she already has a copy. To Ireland she must go to find the answers. But first, she has to settle up things in London. She has to give up the lease on her basement flat. Old habits die hard. She has had 3 experiences that will change her. The businessman who didn't come back for seconds in Harare. The 2 little girls in Manila. The death of her friend Jimmy. Something has begun in her mind, but she is still what she was. And when the landlord of her apartment says, look, for wear and tear over 20-odd years, there's a small charge. But if you're nice to me, there'll be no charge. In return for a few minutes of sex, Kathleen lies down for him. As she says, page 40, lying down for him in silence was the only way to tell him absolutely nothing about myself. She goes to Ireland. She takes with her the 1856 proceedings from the House of Lords. Those 1856 proceedings will contain the minutes of an earlier hearing in Dublin, a separation hearing at the Ecclesiastical Court. And what are the basic facts, the bare bones of the Talbot decision of 1856? Let me refresh your memory. According to the true House of Lords report, a young Englishwoman, Marion McCausland, had married an Englishman, Richard Talbot, in 1845. She had borne him a daughter a year later. In 1848, the third year of the Irish famine, Richard Talbot inherited an estate from an uncle in the west of Ireland. And they go to take possession of Mount Talbot. At about the same time, a local Irishman, William Mullen, finds employment at the Talbot estate as a stable hand. According to the testimony of the servants, a steamy affair began between Marion Talbot, the lady, and William Mullen. One servant, Maria Rooney, even says that she saw them in bed together. She doesn't use the phrase, but she saw them in flagrante delicto. What we used to call in South Wales, rumpitum. After 4 years of marriage in 1852, Richard Talbot seizes his daughter and expels his wife, who was taken by a local clergyman to Dublin. And William Mullen follows her there, tries to make contact with her. And then she is moved again to a Dublin suburban lodging house in the care of a nurse. After the separation hearing in Dublin, some 3 weeks later, she is taken to England, to an asylum near Windsor, near London. In the divorce case in 1856 in the House of Lords, she is defended by a distant relative, a sort of cousin, Richard Paget, QC. But Richard Talbot wins his divorce in the House of Lords on the grounds of his wife's adultery. He even wins damages against the Irish stable hand, William Mullen. But of course, Mullen has no money, and anyway, he has fled to America. A major piece of evidence against Marion Talbot was the alleged confession she had made to a nurse in Dublin. This, when Kathleen de Burgh arrives in Ireland, are the facts she believes of the Talbot case. So she makes her way to the village of Ballygall and the neighboring estate in ruins of Mount Talbot. And once she arrives in Ireland, there will be 3 love affairs. One she will witness, one she will live, and one she will imagine. The first love affair, the one she will witness. When she fled from Ireland at the age of 20, she left behind her younger brother, Danny, to cope with her father. And now, Danny, whom she has not seen in a quarter of a century, is married, is a father, and they live on the old Burke family farm. They live in great poverty because Danny is weak and he is a drunkard. They subsist on what Annie can earn as a shop assistant. Danny has failed at everything he has tried economically. Kathleen is touched by the greeting she receives from her brother and his wife. More than a greeting, page 213, not just a greeting, but a welcome home after half a lifetime. And she gives her brother £1,000 because he talks in his grandiose alcoholic way of selective breeding. But on a later visit, she is told by his sister-in-law that Danny is drinking the money. And yet, Annie, his wife, says of her drunken, weak husband, the failure, he's the best man on earth when he's well. We love him, so we do. Everyone loves him. You know yourself, Kathleen, there's no one as nice as him. I meant it when I said to you that I have had a happy life, thank God. I wouldn't have it different. I wouldn't change Danny for any man on earth. There's no reference to sex, no reference to his weaknesses. This is pure, unconditional, complete love. I wouldn't change Danny for any man on earth. I am certain that it is Annie's love for her brother, as much as any other event in the novel, that begins to move Kathleen back into life. In Ireland, that's perhaps the most dramatic, but it's not the only evidence of that kind of deep and abiding and permanent love that she has seen. She saw it when she arrived in Ireland at Ballygall, and she goes to the Talbot Arms, and she meets the delightful Bertie. You remember Bertie? Bertie. I adored his welcome to her when she arrives at his inn. Sure, we could look after you until Friday anyway, if you don't mind coming down to the kitchen for your meals. And we've a little cottage out on the coast, if you're stuck, when we have to throw you out. But nobody calls it the Talbot Arms. It's Bertie's place. We bought it with the money I won on a horse. Actually, it was my late wife, God preserve her, who picked the horse. I'm Bertie. I defy you as you read it not to smile. Later, Bertie, as they become closer, will counsel Kathleen about men in general. And he says, quote, page 514, they're not worth it, my dear girl, holding me in his big woolen arms and patting my back. I'm one of them, so I know. And in the kitchen of Bertie's pub, Kathleen sees Bertie and his daughter and her children, and baby Ollie is learning to walk. And in this atmosphere of love, Kathleen is moved to think, page 404, I felt as if I had crossed a threshold to be absorbed by watching a child learning to walk, me. She is changing before our eyes. I said that Kathleen will witness one real love affair. I meant her brother and his wife. But she witnesses, in fact, two. Her brother Danny and his wife Annie, and she witnesses a second, Bertie's love affair with life. What of the love affair she lives through? The second. She takes a local ferry and she meets a man, I quote, page 142, close-cropped, grey hair, a lined face, a stocky body, nondescript. He looked like all the middle-aged men you hardly notice. His name is Shay. He's a married man with grown-up daughters. He's born in Ireland, but he lives over in England, near Liverpool. He comes back to Ireland, comes over to Ireland across the Irish Sea fairly frequently to help out his father, who has a little oil delivery business. He and Kathleen on the ferry chat, and when the ferry docks, they go into the local pub for a drink. And from the pub, they go into the alley behind the pub. And on page 149, there is an exceptionally fine passage. He pulled me against him. Then he shoved 2 or 3 fingers into my mouth, and I felt them on my tongue. I gasped. Heat whooshed up through my body. I could feel that he was swollen, and I was glad to make my belly taut for him to push against. If I was still teaching, I would use that passage as an example of exemplary writing. No word has more than 2 syllables. And the short, powerful Anglo-Saxon words are a perfect match for the strength of the sexual feeling. And the passage is typical of Nuala O'Fwellin's prose. She never strains for effect by foolish similes or sought-out metaphors. It is clean, clean prose. It seems effortless, but it takes a lifetime to achieve that kind of writing. Anyway, back to Shay and Kathleen in the alley behind the pub. They adjourn to the cottage, Bertie's cottage that he has lent her. And the sex is magical. A lovely touch, there is a false start. Shay says, I think it's a blood pressure problem. It's so close to life. But in the middle of the night, they wake. And Shay, happily married, and with grown daughters, tell Kathleen, I had forgotten. I had forgotten. But in the morning, he goes out to buy orange juice for breakfast, and he doesn't come back. Like the businessman in Harare, like so many men before. And then there is the note he leaves behind, badly punctuated, badly spelled. Quote, if I did not go then, I could never go at all. I could never leave you if I stayed. You are everything a man could desire. You're a queen in anybody's world. You will always be in my memory. Shay. And it struck me with that letter, the resemblance between Kathleen and Shay, and 150 years earlier, Marianne Talbot and William Mullen. Both of them have given themselves to men who are far, far their social inferior, their educational inferior. And then it struck me there are other similarities. When Kathleen and Shay are together in the pub coming off the ferry, I quote from page 145, Shay's thigh lay alongside mine, where they lightly touched, the thinnest of shudders began. And I thought back to something earlier in the novel, of Marianne's alleged confession to the Dublin nurse in 1853, to the detail of what that Dublin nurse testified from page 110. Mrs. Talbot told me how it commenced, and the way it commenced was this. She went into Mullen's room, and a part of his body came in contact with hers, which caused a thrill to run through her whole frame, and that was the commencement of her downfall. When Shay returns to Kathleen, in spite of his note, not just for seconds, but for hour after stolen hour of lovemaking, it confirmed even more to me that Kathleen's modern love affair is a mirror image of the 19th century Talbot affair, or perhaps vice versa. I realized something else. When Kathleen and Shay make love that first night, when they wake in the middle of the night after a false early start, they come together physically most perfectly when Shay utters the magic words, page 157, you're my little girl, aren't you? Aren't you my little girl? Without the slightest warning, I went open and wet at his tone, and he rolled me on top of him. Those are almost exactly the same words that the author Nuala O'Fwellin's truck driver uses in real life in her autobiography. And then I realized that this is a novel being written at 3 levels. The first is the level of Nuala O'Fwellin and her truck driver. The second, within the novel, is Kathleen de Burgh and Shay. And the third level, within the novel, is Marianne Talbot with the stable hand, William Mullen. Just as Nuala O'Fwellin projects her own life and search for love into her literary creation, Kathleen de Burgh, so within the novel, Kathleen de Burgh projects her search into the 19th century Marianne Talbot-William Mullen affair. In the village of Ballygal, Kathleen de Burgh finds little new evidence. Bertie takes around the ruins, they make some interesting discoveries, but there's no hard evidence. The eyewitnesses are, of course, long dead. Kathleen befriends the local retired librarian, a delightful character like Bertie, who adores her, Nan Leach. But there's nothing to add to the 1856 House of Lords proceedings. These Kathleen examines and re-examines, and out of the cold, hard facts of 1856, she creates an affair. She imagines how it must have been. She conjures up a love affair much like the one she is living with Shay. Both are doomed. Shay, her lover in the moment, is honest with her. Stolen moments are all he can offer her. From page 284, Kathleen speaking, "So I wait around, do I?" I said. I was crying bitterly. "Is that all I can do?" "That's all," he said. "That's all." Kathleen creates everything in her affair with Shay. She projects back 150 years. When Shay says all you can do is wait, she creates a similar moment in the 1840s, 1850s for Marion Talbot, William Mullen. Mullen suggests to his employer, fleeing together, that they flee together to America. Marianne, however, will accept living for the stolen moments. She will not give up her social position. She will endure the long, dull days with her husband for the magic moments with the stable hand. She cannot cross the chasm between them permanently. There are, of course, differences between the 19th century affair and the modern affair. Unlike Marianne and Mullen, Kathleen and Shay are middle-aged. When they swim together in the lake outside Kathleen's cottage, she says, page 409, "Between us, there was a lot of pallid flesh." And I liked that. At one time in bed, Kathleen sees Shay's false teeth on the night table. It's a lovely touch because she realizes that he has taken out his teeth so that he can suck her breast more effectively, give her more pleasure. And consider how she transforms that into an erotic moment in the affair 150 years before. From page 296, Marianne lifted herself half up and pushed the velvet of her dress down and freed her breasts. She poured wine over her breasts. She said, "Taste that," to him, and stuffed her breast into his mouth. He sucked at her for so long that a muscle rose in her breast behind her nipple and became a hard snout. And Kathleen makes flesh in her mind the 19th century lovers. And as she sees their faces, she sees equally vividly the background behind them, the background against which their love played out. She sees the culture shock Marianne must have experienced when she arrived in Ireland in 1848. I quote, "Ireland was a place exhausted by 3 years of famine and a place gripped with fear. Its people were pouring out through the ports, not travelers but emigrants, hordes of them, hauling everything they possessed into the boats, calling out to each other in Irish, crying and lamenting, not leaving but fleeing." And flee, of course, in 1846, 1847, 1848, flee the Irish dead in their hundreds of thousands, even in their millions, to the New World. In Montreal, where I live, there is a great black stone down by the river where they took the dead Irish off. They called them first the famine ships and then the fever ships, because the people who got on were so sick that they became dead. And Kathleen de Burke, for the first time, sees what she had only learned as empty history. North America was the place of refuge at the time of the Great Hunger. And I thought, brilliantly, originally, Nuala reminds us of the Irish dream of escape to America. in the surprising idiom of comedy. A local handyman in the present, sent over to Kathleen's cottage to fix something by Bertie, speaks of the 19th century exodus, page 134. They all went to America, the ones that didn't die. And if I was a younger man, I'd be off to America myself. Reading Playboy every day I'd be. Reading Playboy every day. Aye. It's good to keep your pleasures simple. And as Kathleen makes the 1840s clear in her mind's eye, gives them flesh, she sees in what Marianne never did, the English Protestant landowner. She sees what Nan Leach, the librarian, calls the thousands of neighbors Marianne must have had living in the bog, the marsh around the Mount Talbot estate. They lived in holes in the ground. You saw bones sticking out of hedges, reminds us of the hedges in Manila. Kathleen thinks first in terms of objective history from page 87. Between 1.1 and 1.5 million people died of starvation and famine-related diseases, and scenes of almost unimaginable mass suffering were witnessed. Cowering wretches, almost naked in the savage weather, prowling in turnip fields and endeavoring to grub up roots, famished and ghastly skeletons, such as no words can describe. Little children, their limbs without flesh, their faces bloated yet wrinkled and of a pale greenish hue. And she sees in her mind's eye specific images of people dying on the roads as they crawl to the workhouses established by the English, subsidized, no doubt, by Queen Victoria's £5 contribution to Irish relief just after she donated £10 to the Battersea Dogs Home. The English had no pity. Potatoes were being exported from Ireland during the famine by the English. The English permitted the Irish to starve to death. Marianne sees in her mind's eye children dead with wickedly distended stomachs because they had eaten all that was available to them, mud and grass. Nuala Llewellyn in the novel does not play with the great hunger. She may let her imagination or the imagination of her protagonist work upon the Talbot affair. But what she writes of the great hunger of 1846, 1847, or 1848 is absolutely historically accurate, horribly, horribly accurate. And the misery is an incredible background to what Kathleen perceives must have been a mad, passionate, impossible affair. But it is through her visualization of individual suffering, and through her friendship with Bertie and Nan Leach, and through her witness of the love between her brother and her sister-in-law, that Kathleen is beginning to reconnect with humanity after her long self-imposed exile from authentic living. It is as if now, seeing the bones of children in the hedges in a mind's eye from 150 years back, she begins to understand the children in the hedges in Manila. Suddenly, in the novel, there is a new development. The contact of Nan Leach's in Dublin as a student comes up with new material, a pamphlet put out by Marion Talbot's lawyer, Richard Paget, after the 1856 divorce case. And it makes clear what Catherine de Burca had already begun to suspect, that the servants' evidence was contradictory. That in fact there had likely been no affair between Marion Talbot and William Mullen. It was all something she had dreamed. She sees that the more probable explanation of the divorce is what John Paget calls in the pamphlet a, quote, foul conspiracy. Richard Talbot had wanted either to drive his wife mad or to prove her adultery so that he could marry again more profitably. She may indeed have been driven mad by his abuse. That would account for her confession, alleged confession to the Dublin nurse. There are loose ends. There are strangers not accounted for. The bizarre role of two clergymen. But what matters at the end of the novel is that, I quote from page 512, Kathleen did not know the truth of what happened at Mount Talbot and would never know it. That is key. Because now Kathleen has to face that all she has imagined of that passionate affair is no more than her imagination. When she described William Mullen as, quote, marveling at Marianne's skin, a skin not like silk, only because it was finer than silk. When she describes, quote, the ache between Marianne's legs just from being in the same room as Mullen. When she imagined, quote, Marianne leaving off her pantalettes so she would be naked for her lover under her crinoline, it was no more than a projection of her own affair with Shay. What Kathleen has done is to take an alleged affair in 19th century Ireland and invest it with the passion she had always hoped to encounter in her own sexual meetings. And what she wants with all her heart is for that passion to turn to love. And the reader, this reader at any rate, swept up by what Kathleen imagined happened in Ireland, swept up by a passion which is wholly the creation of Kathleen's desperate yearning. What the reader wants, what Kathleen wants, is that she find not only passion but love with Shay. And then Shay makes his offer. He offers to set her up, Kathleen de Burke, set her up in her own place near Shannon Airport, and he'll fly in one weekend a month, ostensibly to see his father. Should Kathleen accept? Will the monthly high be enough compensation for the month-long low? In her mind, she talks to her absent friend Alex back in London, the secret lay preacher, lay brother, the secret Anglican monk, who would certainly not approve of the arrangement. She talks in her mind to a dead friend, Jimmy. Page 424, Jimmy, I'm 50. 2 of my bottom teeth are wobbling. Coffee gives me heartburn. I dye my hair. Even if a few men want me when I'm going through my 50s and maybe even my 60s, I won't want them. I'll sleep with anyone who asks me, the same as always. But you know yourself how it was. It was ashes, Jimmy. It was lonely as hell. In real life, she confides in Nan Leach, the retired librarian, who's become a great friend, dying of cancer. And Nan Leach, she of the secure childhood and the secure, proper, uneventful, single life, says, page 439, if it were offered to me at your age, I would accept without hesitation. I would read and write while I waited for him, and let me tell you, I believe I would be very, very happy. Faced with all the conflicting opinions, Kathleen thinks, strangely, of something she saw in the Mount Talbot graveyard. She thinks of a blackbird and 2 chaffinches. And she thinks of all the beauty she saw from the cottage that Bertie lent her. Page 135. At the turn of spring into earliest summer, never before had she seen such a wide slope of small fields, their grass patched with the brown of weeds and rushes, fields of a muted and glowing green that lulled the eye, that then was shocked by the huge vista of the turbulent turquoise sea beyond. There was hardly a sign of life, except for the spire of a church in a village over on the bay, to which the green waves were racing. And she realizes the beauty of living, the beauty of creation, all these small things. She phones her sister Nora in New York to say, I'm going back to London to comfort Alex, who has just lost his mother. In short, she decides to embrace the world and humanity in its quiet and tender moments. She will live in the little details of friendship and in the fascinating and beautiful world around her. She will give up the highs and lows for the fuller life of contentment. For Shay, she leaves a phone message, a few lines from the 1946 September song. But the days grow short when you reach September, when the autumn weather turns the leaves to flame, and I haven't got time for the waiting game. Kathleen will not wait for Shay. She will live. And in that decision, there is so much. There is a reconciliation with Ireland, with her childhood. As she flies out of Dublin, back to England, page 526, for the first time in more than 25 years, she makes a prayer. And that is a reconciliation with Catholic Ireland, with her Catholic childhood. Page 526, I huddled over at my window on the plane, peering down as if this time not to lose a second of my leaving. Every moment of life has become precious. On my way to England, like Marianne, no home, like Marianne, no child, like Marianne, no lover, no occupation. I was sitting beside a man with a very nice smile. I smiled back easily. I must have been mad in the old days. Oh, most gracious mother. She hasn't done that for nearly 30 years. Oh, most gracious mother. Let me remember Shay as long as I can, and let this surge of life in me survive into the time without him. And for me, her final reconciliation with herself, with the past, with her childhood, with her Irish past, comes in her imagination of how William Mullen might have died, because there was a William Mullen and he did go to America. From page 527, Mullen dies after the affair that might never have taken place. Page 527, William Mullen was not alone when he died in America. He did fall back onto the path through the clearing very early one autumn morning, but the deer came to feed where he lay. As the morning mists dissolved slowly in the low sun, they were all around him, and he knew it when life was draining from him. When the men from the stable found his body, it did look lonely, but he had seen her dolphin body turning above him. Is that the deer or Marion Talbot? The white torso twisting and turning in a most beautiful way at the very end. And the deer did not move away until he was dead. Now that scene is created, Mullen's death, in defiance of what Kathleen's common sense told her must have been the more mundane truth, that the affair had never happened. But it is a most beautiful story in the real tradition of Irish romanticism. For me, it marks her reconciliation with her Irish past and her Irish heritage. It confirms to me that she has made peace with everything that made her. It's a beautiful end to the novel, but it's not the ending that Nuala O'Fwellyn had planned. In her second memoir, Almost There, published after this novel, she says she had meant when she started to write the novel that Kathleen would accept Shay's offer. I quote from the memoir, "That was the whole point. But as I wrote the scenes of the plot, I discovered that under my own hands, Kathleen was changing. And Nuala O'Fwellyn, the writer, was changing. I quote again from her memoir, "I was doing for myself what I did for Kathleen. I began to multiply the small sources of well-being in my daily life. I was changing myself in symbiosis with my heroine." After she wrote the novel, just as Nuala O'Fwellyn reconnected, Kathleen de Burke reconnected with her brother, Nuala O'Fwellyn reconnects with her sisters. Just as Kathleen de Burke gave up Shay, Nuala O'Fwellyn gives up her Irish truck driver. As Nuala O'Fwellyn says again in the second memoir, "Of all things I would ask of life now, the thing I want most is to learn ordinary, daily love." At the end of the novel, My Dream of You, both the fictitious Kathleen de Burke and her creator, Nuala O'Fwellyn, have abandoned the theory that informed all their casual sex, that sex might lead to passion, which might lead to love. Now both the protagonist in the novel and her creator outside the novel realize that love is what Annie feels for her husband, what Bertie feels for his daughter and his grandchildren, and the undeclared love he has always felt for Nan Leach. Love is what Shay feels for his wife and his daughters. There will be now no more one-night stands, neither for Kathleen de Burke nor for Nuala O'Fwellyn. I promised at the beginning of my talk that I would add one note to the story of the writer, Nuala O'Fwellyn. Since she wrote the first volume of memoir, Are You Somebody? Since she wrote her novel, My Dream of You, since she wrote the second volume of memoir, Almost There has been a change in her life. She is now 62. She has fallen in love with New York. Good. She has met a divorced Jewish lawyer from Brooklyn. They met, God save us all, on the internet. Her twice divorced lawyer, her friend, has an 8-year-old daughter who doesn't like Nuala O'Fwellyn. And Nuala O'Fwellyn knows that she will have to work hard to make the relationship work and to establish some kind of relationship with the little girl. This is not the wild affair of Kathleen de Burke and Shay. It is not the wild affair that Kathleen imagined between Marion Talbot and William Mullen, but it has, I think, a greater chance of success. I think that Nuala O'Fwellyn, the writer, has more chance of finding happiness than she ever had when she lay in the arms of strangers. I'm confident that she will be happy. I am not quite as confident that the tensions between the Irish and the English will ever go away. The English will never forgive Ireland's neutrality during the Second World War. And the Irish will never forget that the English, oppressors of Ireland for nearly 800 years, let those Irish who could not escape to America starve to death during the 3 years of the Great Hunger.